On Christmas morning 2024, William Anderson was found dead in his bed with 3 gunshot wounds to the chest in his modest single-story home on Billings West Side. Emma Anderson, his 16-year-old daughter, made the frantic 911 call at 6:27 a.m., claiming that an intruder had broken in and murdered her father while she hid terrified in her bedroom. The small Montana city of Billings, accustomed to harsh winters but not to brutal holiday homicides, was stunned by the violence that had erupted in what neighbors described as a quiet, ordinary household. Investigators arriving at the snow-covered crime scene found the victim still in his bed, the sheets soaked with blood, and a window in the living room that appeared to have been forced open from the outside. Before we continue, please hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your support helps us continue bringing you these in-depth stories. Now, let's get back to the story. Emma Anderson sat wrapped in a shock blanket on the living room couch, her blonde hair disheveled and her blue eyes vacant, as she repeatedly told officers she had been asleep when she heard gunshots. She claimed to have stayed hidden in her room for nearly an hour before finding the courage to venture out and discover her father's body, at which point she immediately called 911. The teenager's account seemed plausible at first glance. The forced window, missing valuables including William's wallet and watch, and Emma's convincing display of shock all pointed to a home invasion gone tragically wrong. Detective Adrian Mitchell, a 15-year veteran of the Billings Police Department, noted in his initial report that the girl appeared genuinely traumatized, though he would later recall that something about her demeanor felt rehearsed. William Anderson's bedroom showed signs of a violent struggle, the nightstand overturned, a lamp shattered on the floor, and defensive wounds on his hands indicating he had awakened and fought for his life. The murder weapon, a .30-06 hunting rifle that belonged to William himself, was found discarded in the backyard near the fence line, partially buried in a snowdrift, as if the killer had attempted to hide it while fleeing. 3 spent shell casings were recovered from the bedroom floor, and the coroner would later determine that any one of the 3 shots would have been fatal, suggesting an attack fueled by rage rather than necessity. The timing of the murder, between 4 and 6:02 a.m. on Christmas morning, according to the medical examiner's preliminary assessment, added a particularly disturbing dimension to an already tragic scene. In the rugged landscape of Billings, Montana, where the wide open spaces can feel both liberating and isolating, the Anderson home suddenly became the epicenter of the city's attention. Local news crews gathered outside the police tape as neighbors stood in shocked clusters on their front lawns. Christmas decorations creating a surreal contrast to the grim proceedings. Emma was taken to the station for further questioning, ostensibly to get her away from the traumatic scene, though she was not considered a suspect at this early stage. Detective Mitchell ordered a thorough canvass of the neighborhood, hoping someone might have seen or heard something unusual in the pre-dawn hours of Christmas Day, never expecting that a neighbor's doorbell camera would soon become the linchpin of the entire investigation. The Anderson home, a modest 3-bedroom ranch-style house with fading green siding, had been decorated for Christmas with multicolored lights along the eaves and a small artificial tree visible through the front window. Inside, wrapped presents still sat undisturbed beneath the tree. Gifts that would never be opened, including several with tags reading, "To Dad, Love Emma." The kitchen counter held evidence of Christmas Eve preparations, cookie cutters, a rolling pin dusted with flour, and a plate of decorated Christmas cookies covered with plastic wrap. These domestic details stood in stark contrast to the violence that had erupted just hours later, creating a crime scene that even hardened investigators found unsettling in its juxtaposition of holiday cheer and deadly violence. William's bedroom, at the end of a short hallway, had become a horrific final resting place for the 42-year-old science teacher. Blood spatter analysis would later suggest that the first shot had been fired from the doorway while William was sleeping, with the subsequent shots delivered at closer range after he had awakened and attempted to defend himself. The hunting rifle, a Remington 700 with a walnut stock that William used for deer hunting in the mountains outside Billings, required significant force to operate its bolt-action mechanism between shots. This detail would later become significant as prosecutors questioned whether a panicked home invader would have taken the time to chamber multiple rounds rather than fleeing after the first shot, especially if the intruder was supposedly surprised by finding someone at home. As the initial crime scene investigation continued into Christmas afternoon, the Anderson family's personal history began to emerge through interviews with neighbors and colleagues. William had been raising Emma alone since his wife Jennifer died of breast cancer 5 years earlier, a tragedy that had reportedly brought father and daughter closer together. Neighbors described William as strict but loving, a dedicated father who coached Emma's middle school science club and rarely missed her high school volleyball games. Several mentioned that William had seemed concerned about Emma's behavior in recent months, with one neighbor recalling an overheard argument about Emma's curfew just days before the murder. Emma's initial statement described a night of normal Christmas Eve activities, baking cookies with her father, watching It's a Wonderful Life, and going to bed around 10:30 p.m. She claimed to have slept soundly until gunshots woke her shortly after 6 a.m., at which point she hid in her closet until she was certain the intruder had left the house. Her bedroom door had been closed all night, she insisted, and she had seen and heard nothing until the gunshots, a critical detail that would soon be contradicted by unexpected evidence. The teenager's demeanor shifted between moments of emotional breakdown and periods of eerie calm as she recounted finding her father's blood-soaked body, a pattern that experienced investigators recognized as potentially inconsistent with genuine trauma. By nightfall on Christmas Day, as most families in Billings were finishing their holiday dinners, the Anderson home remained an active crime scene bathed in the harsh glow of police floodlights. Technicians meticulously processed evidence late into the night, documenting blood patterns, collecting fibers, and casting impressions of footprints found in the snow outside the allegedly forced window. Emma spent the night at her aunt's house across town, still maintaining her story of hiding from an intruder and expressing appropriate grief over her father's death. Detective Mitchell, however, was already requesting warrant access to Emma's cell phone records and social media accounts, following standard procedure in homicide investigations, even when family members appeared to be victims rather than suspects. William Anderson had been a fixture at Billings West High School for 15 years, where he taught AP chemistry and coached the school's nationally recognized Science Olympiad team. Colleagues described him as passionate about education, the kind of teacher who arrived early and stayed late, often spending weekends helping students with special projects or college applications. His classroom was known for its engaging demonstrations and hands-on experiments, with former students frequently returning during college breaks to thank him for inspiring their scientific careers. William had received the Montana Science Educator of the Year award just 2 years before his death, with the citation praising his ability to make complex concepts accessible while challenging his students to exceed their own expectations. Beyond his professional accomplishments, William was remembered as a devoted single father who had reorganized his entire life after his wife's death to ensure Emma's well-being remained his top priority. The walls of their Billings home were covered with family photos, William and Emma hiking in the nearby Beartooth Mountains, fishing along the Yellowstone River, and smiling together at her middle school graduation. Neighbors recalled William turning down dating opportunities and social invitations if they conflicted with Emma's activities, telling friends that Emma needs stability right now, not a parade of new people in her life. His dedication extended to learning to cook, proper meals, mastering the intricacies of teenage girl fashion choices, and becoming both mother and father to his daughter while maintaining his demanding career as an educator. William's sister, Catherine Anderson Walsh, shared during a tearful interview that her brother had recently expressed concerns about changes in Emma's behavior and friend group. Will called me about 2 weeks before Christmas, worried that Emma was pulling away from him and keeping secrets, Catherine told Detective Mitchell. He said she'd become defensive about her phone, was breaking curfew, and seemed to be lying about where she was going after school. Will thought she might be using drugs or falling in with a bad crowd, but he never imagined anything that could lead to this. Born and raised in Billings, William had deep roots in the Montana community where generations of Andersons had lived since the early 1900s. His father had worked the railroads while his mother taught elementary school, instilling in William a strong work ethic and value for education that shaped his career choice. After earning his chemistry degree at Montana State University and completing a master's in education, William had returned to his hometown specifically to give back to the community that had supported him. The Anderson family name was respected throughout Billings, making the shocking Christmas murder all the more incomprehensible to those who had known William throughout his life. William's passion for the outdoors was legendary among his friends and students, with summer break typically finding him leading wilderness expeditions for the local Sierra Club chapter or working on environmental conservation projects. His hunting rifles, including the weapon that would ultimately end his life, were always properly secured in a gun safe, used only for ethical hunting trips where he taught Emma about respecting nature and harvesting only what was needed. William was known to donate much of his deer meat to the local food bank each year, seeing hunting as a connection to Montana's heritage rather than simply a sport or hobby. The irony that his own carefully maintained hunting rifle would become the instrument of his death would not be lost on prosecutors building their case against his daughter. The Christmas Eve before his murder had followed traditions William had maintained since Emma was a small child. Cutting a fresh Christmas tree from a permitted area in the nearby national forest, baking their secret recipe sugar cookies, and watching classic holiday movies together. Text messages from William's phone, recovered during the investigation, showed him reaching out to family members with warm holiday wishes and confirming plans for Christmas dinner the following day. His final text message, sent to his sister at 9:48 p.m. on Christmas Eve, read, "Merry Christmas. Emma and I had a nice evening baking cookies. Looking forward to seeing everyone tomorrow. Love you." In the faculty lounge at Billings West High School, a makeshift memorial appeared spontaneously when news of William's death reached his colleagues, growing to include candles, photos, and dozens of heartfelt notes from current and former students. "Mr. A showed me I could do things I never thought possible," read one card from a former student now studying chemistry at MIT. "He believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." The school's principal described William as the teacher everyone wanted their child to have, challenging but kind, demanding but supportive, the rare educator who connected with every student regardless of their academic ability or background. The autopsy revealed that William had been in excellent physical condition for a man of 42 with no health issues that would have shortened his life expectancy. The medical examiner noted that had he not been murdered, William could reasonably have expected another 30 to 40 years of life, decades in which he might have seen Emma graduate college, walked her down the aisle, held grandchildren, and continued inspiring generations of students. This potential future, erased in seconds by 3 rifle rounds, was emphasized by prosecutors as they built their case around the magnitude of what had been stolen from William, from his students, and from the Billings community. The brutal manner of William's death contrasted sharply with the gentle, patient man described by everyone who knew him. Medical evidence indicated that he had awakened during the attack, with defensive wounds on his hands and arms showing he had tried to shield himself from the shots. Blood spatter patterns on the headboard and wall suggested he had been sitting up in bed when the final shot was fired at close range, likely looking directly at his killer in the final moments of his life. This detail would haunt those who knew the case intimately. The realization that William Anderson died looking into the face of his own daughter, the child he had devoted his life to raising after her mother's death. William's funeral, delayed until after the new year due to the ongoing investigation, drew over 800 mourners from across Montana and neighboring states. Former students traveled from as far away as Boston and San Francisco to pay their respects to the teacher who had shaped their futures. The high school gymnasium, the only venue in Billings large enough to accommodate the crowd, was filled to capacity as colleagues, students, and community members shared stories of William's kindness, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to education. Emma Anderson was notably absent from the service, her arrest having occurred days earlier, a fact that sent shocked whispers through the gathering, despite the efforts of William's sister to focus the service on celebrating her brother's life, rather than the circumstances of his death. Detective Adrian Mitchell arrived at the Anderson home 20 minutes after Emma's 911 call, navigating his unmarked police vehicle through the nearly empty streets of Billings on Christmas morning. The detective, known for his methodical approach and attention to detail, immediately noted several inconsistencies at the scene that triggered his investigative instincts. The allegedly forced window showed pry marks on the outside frame, but the pattern seemed unusual, too neat, too deliberate, as if someone had studied break-ins from television rather than committing an actual forced entry. The house showed no signs of being ransacked, with only William's wallet and watch missing despite several valuable electronics sitting in plain sight in the living room. Initial forensic processing revealed a crime scene that would yield crucial evidence in the coming days. The hunting rifle found in the backyard snow bore no fingerprints, having been wiped clean, but later testing would reveal traces of Emma's DNA on the bolt-action mechanism. Gunshot residue tests performed on Emma's hands at the station came back positive, a fact she initially explained by saying she had checked her father's pulse and touched the area around his wounds. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated that William had been shot between 4 and 5:30 a.m., based on body temperature and blood coagulation, contradicting Emma's claim that she had heard shots just before calling 911 at 6:27 a.m. As uniformed officers conducted the neighborhood canvass, a crucial piece of evidence emerged that would ultimately break the case wide open. Trevor Phillips, who lived in the house directly across the street, mentioned to officers that his Ring doorbell camera had a view of the front of the Anderson home, including Emma's bedroom window. "I installed it after someone stole our Christmas packages last year," Phillips explained, "and it records whenever there's motion on the street or when someone comes to our door." The footage, which Detective Mitchell immediately requested, revealed a critical contradiction to Emma's story. Her bedroom light could be seen turning on and off multiple times between 4:12 a.m. and 5:48 a.m., during the exact time frame when she claimed to be asleep until being awakened by gunshots. The Ring camera footage became the investigation's breakthrough moment, providing irrefutable evidence that someone was active in Emma's room during the critical time period. The camera's night vision capability clearly showed Emma's bedroom window illuminating and darkening repeatedly, with particularly noticeable activity around 4:40 a.m., approximately when the medical examiner believed William had been killed. Detective Mitchell obtained a search warrant for Emma's phone and laptop based on this contradictory evidence, suspecting that the motive for the crime might be found in her communications. The warrant also allowed officers to return to the Anderson home and conduct a more thorough search of Emma's bedroom, where they discovered blood-spattered clothing hidden inside a ventilation duct accessible by removing a register in her closet floor. Emma's initial police interview, conducted by Detective Mitchell while she was still considered a witness rather than a suspect, revealed a teenager who maintained remarkable composure despite occasional displays of emotion that never quite reached her eyes. She recounted hearing 3 distinct gunshots that woke her from a deep sleep, followed by the sound of someone moving through the house. "I was so scared I hid in my closet and didn't make a sound," she told Mitchell, her voice quavering appropriately. "I waited until I was sure they were gone before I came out and found Dad." When confronted with the Ring camera evidence during a follow-up interview, Emma's carefully constructed narrative began to show cracks. She initially claimed she might have gotten up to use the bathroom during the night, then suggested she sometimes left her light on while sleeping, before finally asserting that the camera must be mistaken about the timestamps. Detective Mitchell noted in his report that Emma's explanations evolved rapidly as each was contradicted by evidence, displaying a troubling ability to generate alternative scenarios on the fly. Her adaptability suggests premeditation rather than panic, Mitchell wrote, as she appears to be selecting the most plausible explanation from a menu of pre-considered options. Forensic analysis of William's hunting rifle revealed it had been removed from his locked gun safe, which showed no signs of forced entry. The combination, according to William's sister, was Emma's birthday, a detail that both Emma and her father would know, but that an intruder would have no way of discovering, especially in the limited time frame of a supposed break-in. The rifle's bolt-action mechanism required significant strength to operate, but testing confirmed that Emma, despite her slight build, could manage it with some effort, particularly with the adrenaline boost that would accompany such a high-stress situation. 3 spent shell casings recovered from William's bedroom floor matched the ammunition stored in the gun cabinet, further contradicting the intruder theory. The medical examiner's detailed report, completed 3 days after the murder, provided a chilling timeline of William Anderson's final moments. The first shot had struck him in the upper chest while he was lying down, likely asleep, penetrating his right lung, but not immediately killing him. The second and third shots had been fired from slightly different angles, as William sat up and tried to protect himself, with the final shot entering his heart and causing almost instantaneous death. The report concluded that the killer had been standing at the foot of the bed for the first shot, then moved closer for the subsequent shots, executing them with deliberate aim rather than panic fire. Emma's schoolmates, interviewed as part of the expanding investigation, painted a picture of a teenage girl who had changed dramatically in recent months. Several friends described Emma as becoming increasingly secretive and withdrawn since the beginning of the school year, often canceling plans at the last minute and becoming defensive when questioned about her whereabouts. One friend, speaking on condition of anonymity, told investigators that Emma had been dating someone older, way older, like college age, but had refused to introduce him to any of her friends. This lead prompted Detective Mitchell to obtain Emma's social media and text message records, which would ultimately reveal the relationship at the heart of the case. As the investigation intensified, officers executed a search warrant on Emma's iPhone, recovering deleted text messages and social media communications that revealed both motive and premeditation. The messages, primarily exchanged with a 23-year-old man named Jake Mercer, detailed a sexual relationship that had been ongoing for approximately 3 months. The communications revealed that William had recently discovered the relationship and threatened to report Mercer to police for statutory rape, which in Montana carries a penalty of up to 100 years in prison if the victim is under 16 years of age. Emma had turned 16 just 2 weeks before the murder, but the relationship had begun when she was still 15, putting Mercer at significant legal risk. The neighbor's Ring camera footage, initially valuable for contradicting Emma's alibi, proved even more crucial when forensic technicians enhanced the video to reveal shadows moving past the bedroom window, By correlating these movements with cellular data showing Emma's phone accessing different Wi-Fi access points within the house, investigators could place her moving between her bedroom and her father's room during the exact time frame when the murder occurred. This digital evidence, combined with the physical evidence of blood-spattered clothing and gunshot residue on Emma's hands, transformed what had initially appeared to be a tragic home invasion into something far more disturbing: a daughter's calculated decision to murder her father rather than end a forbidden relationship. Detective Adrian Mitchell sat alone in the Billings Police Department's digital forensics lab, replaying the Ring doorbell footage for the 6th time in 2 hours. The snow-muted streetscape of the quiet residential neighborhood showed little activity in the pre-dawn hours of Christmas morning, but Emma Anderson's bedroom window told a different story. Mitchell had created a detailed timeline chart, noting each instance when the light went on or off: 4:12 a.m. on, 4:17 a.m. off, 4:22 a.m. on again, and so on, in a pattern that suggested someone moving purposefully through the house rather than sleeping soundly, as Emma had claimed. The detective's experienced eyes caught something he had missed in previous viewings: a shadow passing by the window at 4:38 a.m., moving in the direction of William Anderson's bedroom at the back of the house. Forensic technicians processing the crime scene had recovered 3 shell casings from the bedroom floor, all positioned within a 6-foot radius that suggested a stationary shooter rather than someone moving defensively during a struggle. The blood spatter analysis told a story that contradicted Emma's account of an intruder. The patterns on the walls and ceiling indicated that all 3 shots had been fired from approximately the same position at the foot of William's bed, with no evidence of chaotic movement or struggle until after the first shot had been fired. Most damning was the cast-off blood pattern discovered on the sleeve of Emma's nightshirt, hidden in the ventilation duct, which perfectly matched the arterial spray from William's final chest wound. Emma's gunshot residue test had come back positive on both hands, with particularly heavy concentrations on her right palm and between her thumb and forefinger, a distribution pattern consistent with firing a rifle rather than merely touching a wound site, as she had claimed. When confronted with these results during her second interview, Emma had offered a series of increasingly implausible explanations, from suggesting she must have touched the rifle after finding it in the yard to claiming she had helped her father clean his guns the previous week. Detective Mitchell noted that Emma's explanations became more specific and technical as she realized the weakness of her position, demonstrating a calculated attempt to generate plausible deniability rather than genuine confusion. The turning point came when digital forensic specialists recovered deleted text messages from Emma's phone, revealing both a motive and a timeline that aligned perfectly with the Ring camera evidence. The messages, exchanged with 23-year-old Jake Mercer, painted a picture of a relationship that had crossed multiple boundaries: legal, ethical, and familial. "My dad found out about us," Emma had written at 10:47 p.m. on December 23rd. "He went through my phone while I was showering and saw our pics. He's furious and says he's going to the police after Christmas." Mercer's response had been equally incriminating. "He can't do that to me. I'd lose everything: my job, my apartment, maybe go to prison. You have to talk him out of it." The exchange continued with increasing urgency, with Emma eventually texting, "He said if he catches us together again, he's calling the cops on you for statutory. I can't let that happen." Mercer's final message before the murder, sent at 11:52 p.m. on Christmas Eve, read, "Whatever happens, delete these messages, and remember, I love you. We'll figure something out." The cellular data from Emma's phone provided another layer of damning evidence, showing that despite her claim of being asleep until the gunshots, her phone had connected to different Wi-Fi access points within the house as she moved from room to room. At 4:36 a.m., the phone connected briefly to the kitchen access point, then at 4:40 a.m. to the hallway access point, before returning to the bedroom access point at 4:52 a.m. This digital trail aligned perfectly with the Ring camera's footage of lights turning on and off, creating an irrefutable timeline of Emma's movements through the house during the commission of the murder. During the execution of a search warrant on Emma's school locker, investigators discovered a notebook containing what appeared to be practice signatures of her father's name, dozens of attempts to perfect William Anderson's distinctive handwriting. This discovery prompted a forensic examination of William's financial documents, revealing that someone had attempted to set up a transfer of $50,000 from his retirement account to a newly created checking account just hours before the murder. The transfer had been flagged and held by the bank's fraud department due to the unusual timing and amount, preventing what investigators believed was Emma's attempt to secure funds for herself and Mercer after eliminating her father. Jake Mercer, brought in for questioning 3 days after the murder, initially denied any knowledge of William Anderson's death beyond what he had seen on local news. The 23-year-old shift manager at a local electronics store maintained that he and Emma were just friends and had never had a sexual relationship, a claim immediately contradicted by explicit photographs recovered from both their phones. When Detective Mitchell presented Mercer with the text message exchange about William threatening to contact police, Mercer's demeanor changed visibly, his earlier confidence giving way to nervous fidgeting and stammered responses that suggested consciousness of guilt. While Mercer denied any direct involvement in the murder itself, cell tower data placed his phone within half a mile of the Anderson home between 3:30 a.m. and 4:05 a.m. on Christmas morning, contradicting his alibi of being home alone sleeping. Further investigation revealed that Mercer had purchased a prepaid burner phone 3 days before the murder, which had connected to the cell tower nearest the Anderson home at 4:10 a.m. before being deactivated permanently. This evidence suggested that while Mercer may not have pulled the trigger, he had been in communication with Emma immediately before the crime and may have been waiting nearby, perhaps as a planned getaway driver. The weapon itself provided additional evidence pointing directly to Emma. The Remington 700 rifle, recovered from the snow in the Andersons' backyard, had been wiped clean of prints but still contained microscopic skin cells in the checkering of the wooden stock that DNA analysis matched to Emma. The gun safe from which the rifle had been taken showed no signs of forced entry, and the combination, Emma's birthday, would have been known only to her and her father. Most telling was the methodical way the rifle had been operated. The bolt action had been worked smoothly between shots. The scope had been properly used for targeting, and the safety had been engaged before the weapon was discarded, all indicating someone familiar with the specific firearm. Emma's internet search history, recovered by digital forensics experts, revealed queries in the weeks leading up to the murder that suggested extensive premeditation. How long does gunshot residue last on skin? Can police trace deleted text messages? How to make murder look like break-in, and perhaps, most chillingly, father-daughter murder cases where daughter got away with it. These searches had been conducted in private browsing mode and later deleted, but were recoverable from the laptop's hard drive using specialized forensic tools. The systematic research into methods of concealing evidence demonstrated a level of planning that prosecutors would later cite as evidence of cold, calculated intent. With the evidence mounting, Detective Mitchell made the decision to formally arrest Emma Anderson for the first-degree murder of her father. The arrest took place at her aunt's home 7 days after the murder, with Emma showing little visible reaction as the detective read her Miranda rights. She seemed almost relieved, Mitchell would later testify, as if a weight had been lifted now that the pretense was over. Emma remained silent during the car ride to the juvenile detention center, staring out the window at the snow-covered streets of Billings, the city where she had grown up and where she had, according to the mounting evidence, methodically planned and executed the murder of her own father. District Attorney Olivia Warren stood at the evidence board in the Billings prosecutor's office, methodically connecting the strings between photographs, phone records, and forensic reports that would form the backbone of the state's case against Emma Anderson. The Ring camera footage played on a nearby monitor, showing the telltale flicker of Emma's bedroom light in the pre-dawn hours of Christmas morning. Digital evidence that had cracked the case wide open and led investigators down the path to dozens of additional incriminating discoveries. Warren had been a prosecutor for 20 years, but the calculated nature of this particular crime, committed by a teenager against her own father on Christmas Day, struck her as uniquely disturbing even within her extensive experience with homicide cases. The forensic analysis of Emma's laptop and phone had yielded what Warren considered the strongest evidence of premeditation, a trail of deleted searches revealing weeks of research into methods of staging crime scenes and evading detection. Particularly damning were searches conducted on December 20th, just 5 days before the murder. How to clean gunshot residue from hands, best time for break-in to look realistic, and can police trace deleted text messages between phones? This digital breadcrumb trail painted a picture not of an impulsive act committed in the heat of passion, but of a methodically planned execution designed to eliminate William Anderson while establishing an alibi for Emma. Precisely the kind of premeditation required for a first-degree murder charge. Prosecutor Samuel Phillips, assigned as lead counsel on the case, worked closely with Detective Mitchell to establish a definitive timeline that connected the Ring camera footage with Emma's cell phone activity and the medical examiner's determination of time of death. The resulting chronology was devastatingly precise. At 4:12 a.m., Emma's bedroom light turned on and her phone connected to her room's Wi-Fi access point. At 4:36 a.m., her phone connected to the kitchen access point as she retrieved the rifle from the gun safe. At 4:40 a.m., the phone connected to the hallway access point as she moved toward her father's bedroom. And at 4:43 a.m., the medical examiner's estimated time of the first gunshot based on blood coagulation and body temperature calculations. This timeline, supported by multiple independent sources of evidence, systematically dismantled Emma's initial claim of being asleep until hearing gunshots around 6 a.m. The relationship between Emma and Jake Mercer emerged as the central motive in the prosecution's theory of the case. Text messages recovered from both their devices revealed that William had discovered their inappropriate relationship just 2 days before Christmas, threatening to report Mercer to police for statutory rape once the holiday had passed. Emma's texts to Mercer showed escalating panic about this threat, culminating in the damning message sent at 11:26 p.m. on Christmas Eve. "He's serious about going to the police. He showed me the state law on his computer and said you could get 100 years because I was 15 when we started. I can't let him ruin your life like that. I'll figure something out tonight." Forensic accounting revealed that Emma had attempted to access her father's financial accounts in the hours before the murder, successfully obtaining his banking passwords from his personal journal and attempting to initiate a transfer of $50,000 to a newly opened account in her name. The transfer had been automatically flagged by the bank's fraud prevention system due to the unusual amount and timing, preventing the funds from moving, but providing prosecutors with clear evidence that Emma had planned not only to eliminate her father, but also to secure finances for her future with Mercer. Banking records also showed that Mercer had recently researched apartments in Seattle, suggesting the couple planned to flee Montana after the murder. The murder weapon itself yielded critical evidence linking Emma directly to the crime. While the rifle had been wiped clean of fingerprints, DNA analysis of skin cells found on the wooden stock matched Emma's genetic profile with a probability of 99.9997%. The location where the rifle was discovered, partially buried in snow near the back fence of the Anderson property, matched precisely with footprints leading from the back door of the house, footprints that snow accumulation patterns indicated had been made shortly after 5 a.m. on Christmas morning. Most significantly, the footprints matched the size and tread pattern of Emma's winter boots, recovered from her closet with traces of snow still visible in the tread despite an apparent attempt to clean them. Jake Mercer's involvement in the planning stages became increasingly clear as investigators pieced together his communications with Emma. While there was insufficient evidence to charge him as an accomplice to the actual murder, prosecutors built a compelling case that he had been aware of and tacitly supportive of Emma's plans. Cell tower data placed his primary phone within half a mile of the Anderson home until approximately 4:05 a.m. on Christmas morning, and a prepaid burner phone purchased by Mercer had connected to the tower nearest the Anderson home at 4:10 a.m. before being permanently deactivated. This pattern suggested that Mercer had been standing by nearby, possibly as a planned getaway driver, before the relationship between the burner phone and his regular phone raised suspicions that led him to abandon this part of the plan. The blood evidence recovered from the crime scene told a story that contradicted every element of Emma's initial account of an intruder. Spatter patterns on the walls and ceiling of William's bedroom indicated that all 3 shots had been fired from the same position at the foot of the bed, with the shooter remaining stationary rather than moving defensively during a struggle. Blood found on Emma's nightshirt, hidden in the ventilation duct in her bedroom, contained a spatter pattern consistent with arterial spray from the 3rd and final shot to William's chest, a pattern that could only have been created if Emma had been standing approximately 4 feet from her father when the fatal bullet struck his heart. Most damning was the presence of both Emma's and William's DNA in blood smears found on the gun safe dial, suggesting she had returned the key to the gun cabinet after the murder with her father's blood still on her hands. Interviews with Emma's friends and classmates revealed a teenager who had become increasingly secretive and isolated in the months before the murder, withdrawing from previous social circles and fabricating elaborate stories to explain her whereabouts when meeting with Mercer. Several friends described instances when Emma had expressed frustration with her father's strict rules, particularly regarding dating and curfews, with one friend recalling Emma stating in November, "Sometimes I wish I could just make my own decisions without him controlling everything." While such statements might be typical teenage complaints in normal circumstances, in the context of the murder, they took on a far more sinister tone, suggesting a building resentment that eventually culminated in violence. William Anderson's sister, Catherine Walsh, provided prosecutors with crucial context regarding the family dynamics in the months before the murder. Catherine described a conversation with her brother just 3 days before his death, in which William had expressed serious concerns about Emma's relationship with an older man. "Will told me he'd found inappropriate pictures on Emma's phone and confronted her about who this guy was," Catherine stated in her witness interview. When he realized the man was 23, Will was horrified and told Emma this was illegal and dangerous. Emma apparently became enraged, screaming that he was ruining her life and that he couldn't control who she loved. This account aligned perfectly with the text messages Emma sent to Mercer immediately after this confrontation, providing independent corroboration of the prosecution's timeline and motive theory. As the case against Emma Anderson solidified, District Attorney Warren made the controversial decision to charge the 16-year-old as an adult rather than proceeding through the juvenile justice system. Montana law permitted this approach for first-degree murder cases involving defendants as young as 12, particularly when the crime demonstrated a high degree of premeditation and maturity of judgment. The methodical planning evident in this case, from the research into crime scene staging to the attempted financial transfers, shows a level of calculation that warrants adult prosecution, Warren explained at the press conference announcing the charges. The deliberate nature of this crime, committed against the victim's own father while he slept on Christmas morning, demonstrates a callousness and sophistication that the juvenile system is not designed to address. The formal arrest of Emma Anderson took place on January 2nd, 7 days after the Christmas morning murder of her father. Detective Adrian Mitchell and a female officer arrived at Catherine Walsh's home, where Emma had been staying since the crime, with a warrant charging her with first-degree murder. Catherine, who had been gradually coming to terms with the mounting evidence against her niece, collapsed into a kitchen chair when officers explained the purpose of their visit, her face a mask of disbelief despite the case that had been building day by day. Emma, by contrast, showed little visible reaction to the arrest, maintaining the same oddly detached composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the investigation. As Mitchell read the Miranda warning, Emma stood perfectly still in her aunt's living room, her blue eyes focused somewhere in the middle distance as if she were mentally elsewhere. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The detective noted that while most suspects showed some emotional response to these familiar but consequential words, fear, anger, despair, Emma simply nodded slightly at each statement, as if mentally checking items off a list. Only when the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists did a brief flash of something, perhaps the reality of her situation, cross her face before the mask of calm returned. The drive from her aunt's house to the Billings Police Department took 17 minutes, during which Emma remained silent in the back seat of the unmarked police car, staring out at the snow-covered landscape of the city she had called home her entire life. Detective Mitchell, watching her in the rearview mirror, was struck by her apparent detachment from the gravity of her situation. There were no tears, no desperate proclamations of innocence, none of the panic typically displayed by teenagers in custody. Emma's composure, which might have seemed admirable in other circumstances, struck the experienced detective as profoundly unnatural, reinforcing his growing conviction that they were dealing with a suspect whose emotional responses did not fall within typical parameters. The interview room at the Billings Police Department was deliberately sparse. A metal table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, a video camera in the upper corner, and a one-way mirror along one wall. Emma sat with perfect posture in the hard metal chair, her hands now free of handcuffs, but folded neatly on the table before her, as Detective Mitchell and Dr. Sarah Levine, a forensic psychologist, entered the room. The presence of Dr. Levine was unusual for an initial post-arrest interview, but the psychological aspects of the case, a 16-year-old girl allegedly murdering her father over a forbidden relationship, had prompted the prosecution to request expert observation from the earliest stages of formal questioning. Mitchell began the interview with basic background questions, establishing a rapport while observing Emma's baseline communication patterns, her eye contact, speech rhythms, and body language during non-threatening inquiries. The detective noted that Emma maintained unusually consistent eye contact, rarely blinking and showing minimal variation in facial expression regardless of the question's content. Her responses to questions about school, friends, and hobbies were detailed and articulate, but delivered in a flat effect that suggested she was reciting rather than conversing, a pattern Dr. Levine would later describe in her notes as consistent with rehearsed rather than spontaneous communication. When Mitchell shifted the focus to the Ring camera footage showing Emma the video of her bedroom light turning on and off during the hours she claimed to be sleeping, the first cracks in her composure appeared. "Can you explain why your light was on at 4:12 a.m. when you told us you were asleep until after 6 was?" Mitchell asked, sliding still images from the footage across the table. Emma's eyes flickered briefly to the door before she offered her first explanation. "I probably got up to use the bathroom." When Mitchell pointed out that the pattern showed multiple light switches over nearly 2 hours, Emma's second explanation followed smoothly. "I have trouble sleeping sometimes, so I might have been reading or on my phone." Each explanation came quickly without the pauses or uncertainty that typically accompany truthful recollection, suggesting to both Mitchell and Dr. Levine that these were prepared contingencies rather than genuine attempts to remember. The pivotal moment in the interrogation came when Mitchell placed a printout of Emma's text messages with Jake Mercer on the table, messages explicitly discussing William's discovery of their relationship and his threat to report Mercer for statutory rape. "He said if he catches us together again, he's calling the cops on you for statutory. I can't let that happen." Emma's own words stared up at her from the page. The timestamp showing the message had been sent less than 7 hours before her father was murdered. For the first time, Emma's carefully maintained composure visibly faltered. Her eyes widened, her breathing quickened, and her right hand moved unconsciously to her throat in a classic stress response. "I didn't mean it like that," Emma said, her voice higher and faster than it had been moments before. "It was just talk, just me being dramatic." Mitchell noted that unlike her previous explanations, which had been delivered with steady eye contact, Emma now looked away from both the detective and the text message evidence, her gaze fixed on a point on the wall behind them. "Everyone says things they don't mean when they're upset," she continued, a slight tremor now visible in her hands, despite her apparent attempts to control it. "Jake and I were just venting. We would never have actually done anything to hurt my dad." Mitchell methodically laid out additional evidence: the DNA found on the rifle, the gunshot residue on her hands, the blood-spattered clothing hidden in the ventilation duct, and the internet searches about staging crime scenes. With each new piece of evidence, Emma offered increasingly elaborate explanations, each one less plausible than the last. The rifle DNA was from helping Dad clean his guns last weekend. The gunshot residue came from checking his pulse and touching the wounds. The blood-spattered clothing was from when I found him and held him. Each explanation came quickly, suggesting preparation, but the accumulation of contradictory evidence was clearly wearing down her ability to maintain consistent counter-narratives. 4 hours into the interrogation, after Mitchell had systematically dismantled each of her explanations with contrary forensic evidence, Emma's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed entirely. Her shoulders slumped, her gaze dropped to the table, and her voice, when she finally spoke again, was barely above a whisper. "He was going to ruin everything," she said, the words hanging in the silent interview room. "Jake would have gone to prison. We would never have been together. Dad didn't understand what we had. He just saw Jake's age and went crazy." What followed was a confession that chilled even the experienced detective and psychologist. Emma described waiting until her father was asleep, retrieving the rifle from the gun safe using the combination she had known for years, and standing at the foot of his bed for nearly 10 minutes before firing the first shot. "I wanted to make sure he was really asleep," she explained, her voice now eerily calm again. "I knew the first shot had to be perfect or he might fight back. He was strong, much stronger than me." The clinical detachment with which she described calculating bullet trajectories, working the bolt between shots, and watching her father's final moments struck Dr. Levine as particularly significant, indicating what the psychologist would later testify was an unusual capacity to compartmentalize emotions and remain task-focused during extreme situations. When Mitchell asked about her feelings in the moment of pulling the trigger, Emma's response was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire confession. "I felt nothing. It was like watching someone else do it. I remember thinking about the physics of the bullet, the weight, the speed, the impact, but not about it being Dad. It wasn't until I saw the blood that I realized what was happening, and by then I had to finish it. It would have been cruel not to." This dissociative response, combined with the logical, problem-solving approach to the actual killing, prompted Dr. Levine to make notes about potential personality disorder traits that would become significant during later psychiatric evaluations. The final phase of Emma's confession included details that had not yet been discovered by investigators, lending credibility to her account. She described originally planning to flee with Mercer immediately after the murder, using the $50,000 she had attempted to transfer from her father's retirement account. Jake was supposed to wait down the street in his car, but something went wrong. His phone kept going straight to voicemail after 4:10, and I couldn't risk going looking for him with Dad's blood on my clothes. This detail aligned perfectly with the cell tower data showing Mercer's burner phone connecting briefly at 4:10 a.m. before being deactivated, providing independent corroboration of Emma's account and suggesting that Mercer's involvement in the planning stages was more substantial than he had admitted. As the confession concluded and Mitchell prepared to transfer Emma to the Juvenile Detention Center, she made a final statement that would later feature prominently in both psychiatric evaluations and the prosecutor's case for trying her as an adult. "I know it was wrong in a legal sense, but sometimes you have to make hard choices to protect the people you love. Dad gave me no other option." The calm rationalization of patricide as a reasonable solution to an interpersonal problem, delivered without apparent remorse or emotional distress, struck both Mitchell and Dr. Levine as indicative of a profound disconnect between Emma's cognitive understanding of social norms and her emotional experience of violating them, a disconnect that would become central to the prosecution's portrayal of Emma as a calculating killer who had made a deliberate choice to eliminate her father rather than end her relationship with Mercer. The Yellowstone County Courthouse in Billings, Montana, stood as a monument to justice amidst the rugged landscape, its stone facade dusted with early morning frost on March 15th as the trial of state versus Emma Anderson began. Media trucks lined the street outside, national attention having been drawn to the case of the 16-year-old girl charged as an adult for the Christmas morning murder of her father. Inside the wood-paneled courtroom, Prosecutor Samuel Phillips arranged his materials at the government's table, the methodical organization of his files reflecting the systematic case he intended to present to the jury of 8 women and 4 men who had been seated the previous day after an intensive voir dire process that had eliminated potential jurors with strong opinions about trying juveniles as adults. Emma Anderson sat beside her court-appointed defense attorney, Catherine Morrison, her appearance dramatically transformed from the teenager who had been arrested in January. Gone were the casual clothes and ponytail, replaced by a conservative navy blue dress, minimal makeup, and hair styled to make her appear younger and more vulnerable, a deliberate strategy by the defense team to emphasize her youth to the jury. Despite this careful visual presentation, observers noted that Emma's demeanor remained unusually composed for a teenager facing life imprisonment, her posture perfect, and her expression neutral as she surveyed the courtroom with the detached interest of someone watching a play rather than participating in their own murder trial. Judge Harold Blackwood, a 30-year veteran of the bench known for his strict courtroom management and scrupulous fairness, entered from his chambers and called the court to order. This court will now hear case number CR 2025-0472, State of Montana versus Emma Louise Anderson, he announced, his deep voice carrying to the back of the packed gallery. "The defendant is charged with murder in the first degree in the death of William James Anderson. How does the defendant plead?" Catherine Morrison rose, placing a supportive hand on Emma's shoulder that the teenager neither acknowledged nor shrugged off. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty by reason of diminished capacity." The diminished capacity plea represented the defense's core strategy, not denying that Emma had killed her father, but arguing that her age, emotional state, and the coercive influence of her older boyfriend had rendered her incapable of the kind of deliberate, premeditated decision-making required for a first-degree murder conviction. This approach aimed to secure either a conviction on the lesser charge of second-degree murder or manslaughter, or potentially to have the case remanded to juvenile court, where Emma would face a maximum sentence of confinement until age 21, rather than life imprisonment. Morrison had spent weeks working with psychiatric experts who would testify that Emma's adolescent brain, combined with the emotional manipulation by a much older boyfriend, had created a perfect storm of impaired judgment. Prosecutor Samuel Phillips rose for his opening statement, moving to stand directly before the jury box rather than using the podium, establishing an intimate connection as he began to lay out the state's case. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about choices," he began, his voice measured and conversational rather than dramatic. "Difficult choices, calculated choices, and ultimately a choice to end a human life. The evidence will show that on Christmas morning 2024, the defendant, Emma Anderson, made a series of deliberate decisions that resulted in the death of her father, William Anderson." Phillips methodically outlined the prosecution's timeline, emphasizing the evidence that demonstrated premeditation, the internet searches about staging crime scenes and cleaning gunshot residue, the attempt to transfer money from William's accounts, and the text messages discussing the motive, William's discovery of Emma's relationship with 23-year-old Jake Mercer, and his threat to report Mercer for statutory rape. "This was not an impulsive act of passion or a moment of temporary insanity," Phillips told the jury. "The evidence will show weeks of planning, careful execution, and calculated attempts to cover up the crime afterward. The defendant researched how to make murder look like a break-in, practiced her father's signature to access his money, and created an elaborate false narrative about an intruder that she maintained until confronted with irrefutable evidence. The prosecutor then introduced what would become the centerpiece of the state's case: the Ring doorbell camera footage from the neighbor's house across the street. This seemingly insignificant home security device captured something the defendant never anticipated: proof that she was awake and moving through the house during the exact time frame when her father was murdered, directly contradicting her claim of being asleep until hearing gunshots. A large screen displayed still images from the footage, showing Emma's bedroom light turning on and off at critical times. This digital evidence, combined with cell phone records placing her phone moving through different parts of the house at these same times, will establish beyond any reasonable doubt that Emma Anderson was not only awake, but actively carrying out a murder plan during the hours she claimed to be sleeping. Phillips then addressed the defense's diminished capacity strategy head-on, a tactical decision to diffuse its impact before it was even presented. You will hear arguments that Emma Anderson was too young, too emotional, too influenced by an older boyfriend to be held fully accountable for her actions. But the evidence will show a level of planning, problem-solving, and rational decision-making that belies any claim of diminished capacity. He held up printouts of Emma's internet searches, displaying them for the jury. These are not the actions of someone with impaired judgment or decision-making. These are the methodical preparations of someone who has decided that murder is a solution to their problems and is taking steps to avoid getting caught. Defense attorney Catherine Morrison's opening statement presented a starkly different interpretation of the same facts, framing Emma as a victim herself, of manipulation by an older man, of a brain still developing the capacity for impulse control and judgment, and of a society that sexualizes teenage girls while punishing them for responding to adult attention. Emma Anderson was 15 years old when she met Jake Mercer, a man 7 years her senior, who systematically isolated her from friends and family while engaging her in an illegal sexual relationship, Morrison told the jury, her voice conveying quiet outrage. What the prosecution calls planning was in reality the desperate flailing of a traumatized child who had been convinced by her adult abuser that her father's appropriate parental intervention would destroy both their lives. Morrison directly addressed the Ring camera evidence, acknowledging its factual accuracy while reframing its interpretation. Yes, Emma was awake during those hours. Yes, she took the rifle. Yes, she ended her father's life. These facts are not in dispute. She paused, making eye contact with several jurors. What is in dispute is whether a 16-year-old girl in the midst of psychological manipulation by an adult sexual predator who had been told repeatedly that her father was going to ruin both their lives, possessed the full capacity to premeditate murder in the legal sense required for a first-degree conviction. The evidence will show that Emma was operating under extreme emotional distress with a brain physiologically incapable of the kind of rational risk assessment and impulse control we expect from adults. As opening statements concluded, Judge Blackwood instructed the prosecution to call its first witness, and Samuel Phillips announced, "The state calls Detective Adrian Mitchell." The veteran detective took the stand and, after being sworn in, began methodically establishing the basic facts of the case: the Christmas morning 911 call, the initial crime scene observations, and the gradual shift from viewing Emma as a victim to identifying her as the prime suspect. Mitchell's testimony was delivered with the precise, unemotional professionalism that had characterized his investigation, allowing the facts to create their own impact without embellishment or drama. Phillips displayed crime scene photographs on the courtroom monitor showing William Anderson's body in his bed, the blood-soaked sheets, and the 3 bullet wounds to his chest. The brutality of the images caused visible reactions among the jurors, with several wincing or looking away momentarily. Emma, however, showed no discernible response to the photographs of her father's body, a lack of affect that did not go unnoticed by the jury, despite the judge's instructions to focus on evidence rather than the defendant's courtroom demeanor. Mitchell explained the trajectory of each bullet, the lack of defensive wounds on William's hands for the first shot, suggesting he had been asleep, and the evidence that the shooter had remained in essentially the same position for all 3 shots. The detective then described the discovery that had broken the case open: the neighbor's Ring doorbell camera footage contradicting Emma's alibi. This evidence was crucial because it established that someone was active in Emma's room during the exact time frame when William Anderson was killed, Mitchell explained, as Phillips played the relevant portions of the footage. The light pattern showed activity at 4:12 a.m., 4:22 a.m., 4:36 a.m., and several other times, directly contradicting Ms. Anderson's statement that she had been asleep until hearing gunshots around 6:00 a.m. During cross-examination, defense attorney Morrison worked to humanize Emma while questioning Mitchell, focusing on her age, her emotional state immediately after the murder, and the potentially coercive nature of police interrogation techniques used with adolescents. Detective, would you agree that teenagers often make impulsive decisions without fully considering consequences? Morrison asked. Mitchell acknowledged this general principle while maintaining that Emma's actions had shown systematic planning rather than impulsivity. And would you agree that a 16-year-old's brain is not fully developed in terms of impulse control and risk assessment? Again, Mitchell conceded the general point while emphasizing the specifics of Emma's case that indicated deliberate planning. The most dramatic moment of Mitchell's testimony came when Phillips introduced the recovered text messages between Emma and Jake Mercer, displaying them on the courtroom monitor for the jury to read. He said if he catches us together again, he's calling the cops on you for statutory. I can't let that happen. Emma's words, sent hours before her father's murder, hung in the courtroom like a confession. Morrison objected to the presentation of these texts without proper context, arguing they represented the desperate words of a manipulated child rather than evidence of murderous intent. But Judge Blackwood overruled, allowing the messages to stand as evidence for the jury to interpret. As the first day of testimony concluded, Phillips had established a solid foundation for the prosecution's case, presenting concrete evidence of Emma's movements on Christmas morning through the Ring camera footage and introducing the text messages that established a clear motive for the crime. Morrison, meanwhile, had begun laying groundwork for the diminished capacity defense, emphasizing Emma's youth and the potentially coercive influence of her relationship with Mercer. The stage was set for what promised to be a trial that would explore not only the facts of William Anderson's murder, but the broader questions of adolescent brain development, legal culpability, and the justice system's approach to juvenile offenders charged with adult crimes. Dr. Raymond Griffith, the state's digital forensics expert, took the stand on the fourth day of the trial, his academic demeanor and precise language lending scientific credibility to what would become the most technically compelling testimony against Emma Anderson. With 20 years of experience in digital evidence analysis and a Ph.D. in computer science, Dr. Griffith methodically explained how multiple independent digital systems had captured Emma's movements on Christmas morning, creating what he called a digital fingerprint timeline that contradicted her initial alibi at every turn. The expert adjusted his glasses as the prosecution displayed a complex timeline chart mapping the Ring camera footage, cell phone data, and Wi-Fi connection logs onto a single chronological framework that placed Emma moving through the house precisely when her father was killed. The Ring doorbell camera across the street captured Emma's bedroom light, turning on at 4:12 a.m., Dr. Griffith explained, pointing to the corresponding video segment. At this exact same moment, cellular data shows her phone connecting to the Wi-Fi access point in her bedroom. This pattern continues as she moves through the house. At 4:36 a.m., her phone connects to the kitchen Wi-Fi access point, which corresponds with the light pattern changes visible in the Ring footage. At 4:40 a.m., her phone connects to the hallway access point, and at 4:43 a.m., the medical examiner's estimated time of the first gunshot, her phone is connected to the access point nearest her father's bedroom. The digital forensics expert then presented his analysis of Emma's internet search history, displaying a chronological list of queries that painted a disturbing picture of premeditation. How to make murder look like break-in, December 10th. Cleaning gunshot residue from skin, December 18th. How long after death can coroner determine time, December 20th. And most damning, will deleting text messages remove evidence, December 24th, just hours before the murder. Dr. Griffith explained the technical process by which these searches had been recovered despite Emma's attempts to delete her browsing history, noting that digital evidence is remarkably persistent, even when users believe they have removed it. During cross-examination, defense attorney Catherine Morrison attempted to challenge Dr. Griffith's interpretation of the digital evidence, suggesting alternative explanations for the internet searches and phone movements. Isn't it possible that a teenager might search for information about crimes out of simple curiosity, perhaps related to a television show or school assignment, she asked. Griffith acknowledged this possibility in general terms, but countered that the specific pattern and timing of these searches combined with their direct relevance to the crime as it was actually committed, makes coincidental curiosity extremely unlikely from a statistical perspective. Dr. Sarah Levine, the forensic psychologist who had observed Emma's post-arrest interrogation, provided testimony that the prosecution strategically positioned between technical experts to maintain the jury's engagement. Dr. Levine described Emma's unusual emotional presentation during questioning, her flat affect, her rapid generation of alternative explanations when confronted with evidence, and most significantly, her lack of emotional response when discussing her father's death. What struck me as particularly notable was Ms. Anderson's ability to describe the physical act of shooting her father 3 times with remarkable detachment, as if recounting a scene from a movie rather than her own actions, Dr. Levine testified, her professional demeanor not quite masking her own disturbance at what she had witnessed. The psychologist went on to explain that while adolescent brains are indeed still developing, particularly in areas related to impulse control and risk assessment, Emma had demonstrated none of the typical adolescent patterns of impulsive decision-making. The level of planning evident in this case, from researching methods to stage a break-in, to practicing her father's signature for financial transfers, to creating and maintaining a detailed false narrative, shows sustained, goal-directed behavior over weeks, not the kind of impulsive action we typically associate with adolescent crime, Dr. Levine explained, while Ms. Anderson's age is certainly relevant to understanding her actions. The evidence suggests a level of calculated planning more consistent with adult patterns of criminal behavior than with typical adolescent impulsivity. The defense's cross-examination of Dr. Levine focused on challenging her qualifications to assess adolescent brain development, emphasizing that her specialty was in criminal psychology rather than adolescent neuroscience. Morrison also questioned whether Dr. Levine's assessment had been biased by her close work with law enforcement during the investigation. "Isn't it true, Doctor, that you were brought into this case by the prosecution specifically to build a case against my client, rather than to provide an objective assessment?" Morrison asked, her tone suggesting the answer was self-evident. Dr. Levine firmly rejected this characterization, citing her professional ethics and explaining that her role had been to observe and document Emma's psychological presentation, not to assist in building the prosecution's case. The testimony that seemed to most visibly affect the jury came from William Anderson's sister, Catherine Walsh, who provided a deeply personal window into the victim's life and his relationship with his daughter. Catherine described her brother as a devoted single father who had reorganized his entire life after his wife's death to ensure Emma's well-being remained his top priority. "Will loved Emma more than anything in the world," she testified, her voice breaking with emotion. "After my sister-in-law died, he turned down job opportunities that would have advanced his career but taken time away from Emma. He learned to cook, helped with homework, attended every volleyball game and science fair. Everything he did was for her." Catherine went on to describe the conversation she had with her brother just 3 days before his murder when he discovered Emma's relationship with Jake Mercer. "Will was distraught, not angry," she recalled. "He showed me the inappropriate pictures he'd found on Emma's phone and said, 'She's just a child, Kat. This man is taking advantage of her.' He was worried about protecting Emma, not punishing her." This testimony directly contradicted the defense's portrayal of William as a controlling father interfering with his daughter's happiness, instead presenting him as a parent genuinely concerned about her welfare and trying to protect her from an illegal and potentially exploitative relationship. When asked about Emma's behavior after the murder, during the week she stayed at Catherine's home before her arrest, her aunt described a behavior that several jurors visibly found disturbing. "She never cried, not once," Catherine testified. "She talked about the funeral arrangements as if we were planning a school event. asking about the catering and whether we should have programs printed. The night before her arrest, I found her looking at college websites, schools in Washington State, far from Montana. When I asked if she was thinking about the future, she said, "I have to move forward. Dad would want that." There was something so wrong about how normal she seemed. Jake Mercer's testimony, which the prosecution had strategically saved for late in their case, provided critical corroboration of the motive established through the recovered text messages. Though Mercer had not been charged as an accomplice due to insufficient evidence of direct involvement in the murder itself, he had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution for his sexual relationship with Emma while she was under 16. Mercer appeared nervous on the stand, his testimony halting and reluctant as he confirmed that William Anderson had discovered their relationship and threatened to report him to police after Christmas. "Emma texted me that her dad had found out about us," Mercer testified, avoiding eye contact with both the prosecutor and Emma. "She was freaking out, saying he was going to call the cops and I could go to prison. I told her we needed to cool things off, maybe break up for a while until she turned 18, but she kept saying she couldn't lose me, that she'd figure something out." When asked directly about his knowledge of Emma's plan to kill her father, Mercer denied any prior knowledge or involvement, claiming that his presence near the Anderson home in the early hours of Christmas morning had been coincidental, an explanation the jury appeared to find implausible based on their visible reactions, though insufficient evidence existed to charge him as an accessory. The defense's case centered on testimony from Dr. Miranda Chen, a nationally recognized expert in adolescent neuroscience who provided detailed explanations of how teenage brains differ structurally and functionally from adult brains, particularly in areas related to impulse control, emotional regulation, and decision-making under stress. Using colorful brain scan images displayed on the courtroom monitor, Dr. Chen explained that the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for rational decision-making and understanding long-term consequences, remains underdeveloped until the mid-20s, while the limbic system, which processes emotions and rewards, is already fully functional in adolescence. This developmental mismatch creates a perfect storm in the teenage brain, Dr. Chen testified, where strong emotions and desire for reward can overwhelm the still developing systems for rational control and decision-making, particularly in situations involving intense emotional states or perceived threats to important relationships. The neuroscientist explained that from a brain development perspective, Emma's age placed her at a particularly vulnerable point where the capacity for adult-like reasoning existed, but could be easily overwhelmed by emotional factors, especially in the context of a sexual relationship with an older partner who held significant psychological influence. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Phillips challenged Dr. Chen's application of general neuroscience principles to Emma's specific case. Dr. Chen, would you agree that despite these general patterns of brain development, many 16-year-olds are capable of understanding that killing another person is wrong? He asked. Chen acknowledged this point, but emphasized that understanding an action is wrong in the abstract is different from having the neurological capacity to apply that understanding in emotionally charged situations. Phillips then displayed Emma's internet search history, asking, "Do these systematic searches over weeks, carefully designed to plan a murder and avoid detection, suggest impulsive action or calculated planning?" Chen conceded that the searches indicated planning rather than impulse, but maintained that such planning could still occur under the influence of emotional distress and manipulative pressure from an adult sexual partner. The most scientifically precise testimony came from Dr. Elaine Fujimoto, the medical examiner who had performed William Anderson's autopsy. Using detailed anatomical diagrams rather than the more disturbing autopsy photographs out of respect for the court's decorum, Dr. Fujimoto explained the path of each bullet through William's body and the timing of his death based on blood coagulation and body temperature. The first bullet entered the upper right chest, puncturing the lung but not causing immediate death, she explained. The victim would have awakened at this point, likely in extreme pain and gasping for breath. The second bullet entered the left shoulder area, as the victim was apparently sitting up based on the bullet's downward trajectory. The third and final shot entered directly into the heart, causing immediate cessation of cardiac function and death within seconds. This clinical description of William's final moments had a visible impact on the jury, with several members wincing or looking down at their hands. Dr. Fujimoto went on to explain that the precision of the shots, particularly the final heart shot, suggested someone familiar with firearms and anatomy. The third shot was placed with remarkable accuracy for someone in a high-stress situation, she noted. It struck precisely where it would cause the most immediate fatal damage. When asked by the prosecution whether this level of accuracy was consistent with a panicked or impulsive shooting, Dr. Fujimoto stated that in her professional experience, such precision typically indicated a degree of focus and intentionality not usually present in impulsive violence. As the evidence phase of the trial neared its conclusion, Emma Anderson herself took the stand against the advice of her defense team, a decision that would prove pivotal in the jury's ultimate assessment. Dressed in a simple blue dress with her hair pulled back, Emma appeared younger and more vulnerable than she had at the start of the trial, though observers noted that her composure remained unusual for a teenager facing life imprisonment. Her testimony began with a soft-spoken account of her childhood, her mother's death from cancer, and her close relationship with her father in the years that followed. "I loved my dad," Emma testified, her voice steady despite the courtroom's tension. "He was my best friend after Mom died. He taught me to fish, helped me with science projects, came to every volleyball game." When asked by her attorney about the changes in their relationship, Emma described meeting Jake Mercer at the electronics store where he worked, the gradual development of their romantic relationship, and her father's discovery of their inappropriate text messages and photos. "Dad was so angry," she said, the first tears of the trial finally appearing in her eyes. "He said Jake was a predator who was using me, that he was going to call the police and have him arrested. I tried to explain that we loved each other, but Dad wouldn't listen." Emma's account of the murder itself was delivered with disturbing detachment, despite the emotional setup that had preceded it. "I couldn't sleep that night," she testified. "I kept thinking about Jake going to prison, about never seeing him again. I remembered the combination to Dad's gun safe. It was my birthday. I stood in his doorway for a long time just watching him sleep. I don't remember pulling the trigger the first time, but I remember the sound. And Dad sitting up, blood on his chest. After that, I just wanted it to be over quickly, so he wouldn't suffer." This clinical description of patricide, delivered without the emotional distress one would expect from a teenager recounting such a traumatic event, appeared to disturb rather than persuade many jurors, whose expressions reflected increasing skepticism as her testimony continued. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Phillips methodically walked Emma through her internet searches about staging crime scenes and cleaning gunshot residue, her attempt to transfer money from her father's accounts, and the elaborate false narrative she had maintained until confronted with the ring camera evidence. Throughout this questioning, Emma maintained a composed, almost analytical demeanor, explaining each action as a response to her fear of losing Jake and her belief that her father wouldn't understand our love. When Phillips directly asked, "Do you feel remorse for killing your father?" Emma's response seemed to crystallize the jury's assessment. "I regret that it came to that. I wish there had been another solution." The conspicuous absence of emotional language, no mention of missing her father, of loving him, of wishing she could undo her actions, hung in the courtroom like an unspoken confession of the emotional disconnect that had allowed a daughter to murder her father over a forbidden relationship. On April 2nd, after 7 days of testimony and 14 hours of deliberation, the jury in the case of State versus Emma Anderson returned to the Yellowstone County Courthouse ready to deliver their verdict. The crowded courtroom fell silent as the 12 jurors filed in, their expressions grave and purposeful as they took their seats in the jury box. Judge Harold Blackwood, his black robes a stark contrast to the warm wood paneling of the courtroom, addressed the jury foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, rose and replied, "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff carried the verdict form to Judge Blackwood, who reviewed it briefly before returning it to be read aloud. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the foreperson stood again and unfolded the paper in her hands. In the case of State of Montana versus Emma Louise Anderson, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we the jury find the defendant. She paused, making eye contact with Emma for the briefest moment. Guilty. A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel, as Catherine Walsh covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Not for the verdict itself, which she had come to expect, but for the finality it brought to the destruction of her family. Emma Anderson, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the trial, showed her first significant emotional reaction to the verdict. Her face paled visibly, her eyes widening as the reality of her situation seemed to finally penetrate the detachment she had displayed for months. Defense attorney Catherine Morrison placed a supportive hand on her client's shoulder as Judge Blackwood asked, "Is this the unanimous verdict of the jury?" Each juror responded affirmatively as their names were called, many looking directly at Emma as they confirmed their decision, some with sadness, others with the firm resolve of those convinced of justice served. Judge Blackwood scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, allowing time for the preparation of pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. As Emma was led from the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, she glanced back at the nearly empty defense section of the gallery. No family members remained to support her, her aunt having aligned herself with the prosecution after becoming convinced of her niece's guilt. The only person who met Emma's gaze was Jake Mercer, who had attended sporadically throughout the trial despite his own legal jeopardy and social ostracism in Billings. Their brief eye contact across the courtroom would be dissected endlessly by media commentators in the days that followed, some seeing remorse in Emma's expression, others noting the apparent absence of any emotional connection between the two despite the relationship that had allegedly motivated the murder. The sentencing hearing on April 16th drew national media attention, with legal analysts debating whether Judge Blackwood would impose the maximum possible sentence on a juvenile defendant or show leniency based on Emma's age despite the brutal nature of the crime. The courthouse steps were crowded with protesters holding contradictory signs, some demanding justice for William with maximum sentencing, others arguing children don't belong in adult prisons, and advocating for rehabilitation rather than punishment. The polarized response reflected broader national debates about juvenile justice, with Emma Anderson becoming an unwitting symbol in arguments about adolescent brain development, appropriate punishment, and the justice system's handling of juvenile offenders. Inside the courtroom, Catherine Walsh delivered a victim impact statement that moved many observers to tears, speaking directly to her niece as she described the devastating impact of William's murder. "Emma, your father loved you more than anything in this world," she said, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. "He changed careers to be more present for you after your mother died. He learned to cook your favorite meals, helped with your homework, and cheered at every volleyball game. He was so proud of your intelligence, your determination, your potential. And now he's gone, not because of illness or accident, but because you decided His life was worth less than your relationship with a man who manipulated and exploited you. Walsh continued, addressing not only the personal loss, but the broader impact of William's murder on his students and community. You didn't just kill your father that morning. You took a beloved teacher from hundreds of students past and present. You took a dedicated environmental advocate from our community. You took a brother, a friend, a colleague who had decades of contribution still to make. And for what? For a relationship with a man who hasn't even tried to contact you since your arrest, who testified against you to save himself. This statement caused Emma to look toward Jake Mercer in the gallery, seeing for the first time that he had not attended the sentencing hearing, his absence perhaps finally bringing home the reality that the relationship she had killed for was already over. Prosecutor Samuel Phillips focused his sentencing recommendation on the premeditated nature of the crime and Emma's apparent lack of genuine remorse. Your Honor, the evidence presented at trial demonstrated not a moment of passion or impulsivity, but weeks of calculated planning culminating in an execution-style murder carried out while the victim slept, Phillips argued. The defendant researched methods to stage the crime scene, attempted to secure finances for her escape, and maintained an elaborate false narrative until confronted with irrefutable evidence. Perhaps most disturbing is her continued inability to express authentic remorse for taking her father's life. Her statements focus on regret for the consequences to herself rather than grief for the life she took. Defense attorney Catherine Morrison made a passionate plea for leniency based on Emma's age, arguing that recent Supreme Court decisions had recognized the diminished culpability of juvenile offenders due to their still developing brains. Your Honor, the law has increasingly recognized what science has proven, that adolescents are fundamentally different from adults in ways that directly impact culpability, Morrison argued. Emma's brain, like that of all teenagers, is still developing the capacity for impulse control, risk assessment, and resistance to peer influence. The influence of a predatory older boyfriend, combined with her age and the trauma of losing her mother during formative years, created circumstances that warrant consideration during sentencing. When offered the opportunity to speak before sentencing, Emma rose slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she faced Judge Blackwood. "I know what I did was wrong," she began, her voice barely audible at first. "I can't take it back, no matter how much I might want to. I've had a lot of time to think in jail, and I understand now that Jake manipulated me, that Dad was trying to protect me." She paused, seeming to struggle with her words for the first time in the proceedings. "I miss my dad. I miss who I was before all this happened. I'm sorry for what I did, and I know sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer." This statement, which might have seemed appropriate from another defendant, struck many observers as strangely performative coming from Emma. The words conventionally correct, but delivered with an emotional flatness that suggested recitation rather than authentic expression. Judge Blackwood watched her carefully throughout, his expression revealing nothing of his assessment of her sincerity. When Emma had returned to her seat, the courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver his sentence, the weight of his decision hanging in the air. Judge Blackwood began by acknowledging the unique challenges of sentencing a juvenile defendant for such a serious crime. "The court is mindful of recent jurisprudence regarding juvenile offenders and the scientific evidence of adolescent brain development," he stated, giving momentary hope to the defense team. However, the court must also consider the specific circumstances of this case, including the extensive premeditation, the violation of the profound trust between parent and child, and the defendant's apparent inability to fully appreciate the moral gravity of her actions even after months of reflection. The judge continued, addressing Emma directly as he approached his decision. "Ms. Anderson, you took the life of the person who loved you most in this world, who had dedicated his life to your well-being since your mother's passing. You did so not in a moment of passion or under extreme duress, but after weeks of planning, motivated by a desire to continue a relationship that was itself inappropriate and potentially exploitative. While your age is a mitigating factor that the court has carefully considered, the calculated nature of this crime, the vulnerability of the victim as he slept, and your sustained efforts to avoid responsibility demonstrate a level of moral culpability that cannot be dismissed as mere adolescent impulsivity. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath as Judge Blackwood delivered his final judgment. It is therefore the sentence of this court that you, Emma Louise Anderson, having been found guilty of murder in the first degree, shall be committed to the Montana State Prison for the term of your natural life without the possibility of parole. The pronouncement fell like a physical blow, causing Emma to sway slightly in her seat as the judge continued, "You have taken a life that cannot be restored and broken a trust that cannot be repaired. The magnitude of this crime, committed against your own father as he slept on Christmas morning, warrants the maximum penalty provided by law." Judge Blackwood then uttered the words that would be quoted in headlines across the country. "Ms. Anderson, given your age and the nature of this sentence, I feel compelled to make its meaning absolutely clear to you. This court is sentencing you to die in prison. You will never again know freedom. You will grow old and eventually die while incarcerated. This is the consequence of your decision to end your father's life." The brutal clarity of this statement finally broke through Emma's composure, her face crumpling as the reality of her future became inescapable. As the deputies moved to take Emma into custody, she turned toward her aunt in the gallery, reaching out one hand in a gesture that seemed to seek connection or forgiveness. But Catherine Walsh turned away, unable to meet the eyes of her brother's killer despite their blood relation. This final rejection appeared to complete Emma's emotional collapse, and she was led from the courtroom in tears. The composed, calculating demeanor she had maintained throughout the investigation and trial finally giving way to the reality of a 16-year-old girl facing a lifetime behind bars, with no family remaining to support her, and the relationship she had killed for already dissolved. Outside the courthouse, reactions to the sentence were sharply divided along predictable lines. Victim advocates and those who had known William Anderson expressed satisfaction with what they viewed as appropriate justice for a calculated murder, while juvenile justice reformers and child development experts criticized the sentence as excessively harsh for an offender whose brain was still developing. Media commentators debated whether the case represented justice served or an example of the justice system's failure to appropriately distinguish between adult and juvenile offenders, with Emma Anderson becoming an unwitting symbol in the ongoing national conversation about juvenile justice reform. 6 months after Emma Anderson's sentencing, the Montana Women's Prison in Billings had become her permanent residence, the teenager assigned to a special unit for high-profile offenders requiring additional security measures. Prison officials reported that Emma had initially struggled with the rigid structure and loss of autonomy, her previous self-possession giving way to periods of emotional volatility alternating with withdrawn silence. The prison psychologist noted in her assessment that Emma showed signs of delayed traumatic response, as if the emotional reality of her actions and their consequences had been held at bay during the trial, only to emerge with devastating force once the possibility of freedom was permanently removed. Medications were prescribed for depression and anxiety, conditions that the psychologist noted were not unexpected in an adolescent facing a lifetime of incarceration for killing her parent. Emma's first appeal, filed in October 2025, focused on the constitutionality of sentencing a juvenile offender to life without parole, citing recent Supreme Court decisions that had restricted such sentences for defendants under 18. Her appellate attorney, Marcus Jenkins of the Montana Innocence Project, argued that the sentence constituted cruel and unusual punishment given Emma's age at the time of the offense and contemporary understanding of adolescent brain development. The Montana Supreme Court, however, upheld the sentence in a 4-3 decision, finding that the particularly calculated nature of the crime and the extensive evidence of premeditation placed Emma's case within the narrow category of juvenile offenses still eligible for life without parole under federal precedents. Jake Mercer, whose relationship with Emma had been the catalyst for William Anderson's murder, left Billings immediately after the trial, his reputation destroyed and his future prospects in Montana non-existent, despite having avoided criminal charges related to the murder itself. He eventually settled in Seattle under a slightly altered name, but the digital footprint of his involvement in the case followed him, resulting in lost jobs and housing opportunities whenever new employers or landlords searched his background. While Emma served her sentence in prison, Mercer experienced a different kind of punishment, social ostracism, and the inescapable knowledge that his relationship with a minor had set in motion the events leading to William Anderson's death, a burden that acquaintances reported he carried with visible weight. Catherine Walsh, William's sister and Emma's aunt, sold the Anderson family home 6 months after the sentencing, unable to drive past the property without being overwhelmed by memories of both her beloved brother and the niece who had destroyed their family. The house sold significantly below market value, despite the strong Billings real estate market, the stigma of the Christmas murder making many potential buyers uncomfortable, despite the property's attractive features. Catherine established a scholarship in William's name at Billings West High School, providing annual funding for a promising science student to pursue higher education, ensuring that her brother's legacy as an educator would continue despite his untimely death. The scholarship's first recipient was Mia Hernandez, a senior at Billings West who had been in William Anderson's AP chemistry class during his final semester of teaching. At the scholarship award ceremony, Mia spoke movingly about Mr. Anderson's influence on her educational journey. Mr. Anderson was the first teacher who ever told me I could be a scientist, who showed me that chemistry wasn't just about memorizing formulas, but about understanding how the world works at its most fundamental level. He stayed after school for hours helping me prepare for the AP exam, and when I got a 5, he was as excited as if it had been his own achievement. I'm going to major in chemistry at Montana State because of him, and I hope to become the kind of teacher he was, someone who changes lives. Emma's case became a focal point in ongoing national debates about juvenile justice reform, with legal scholars and child development experts citing it in arguments about the appropriateness of trying juveniles as adults and imposing adult sentences on offenders whose brains are still developing. A documentary titled Christmas Morning: The Emma Anderson Case premiered at the Sundance Film Festival in January 2026, presenting a nuanced examination of the case that neither excused Emma's actions nor ignored the questions raised by sentencing a 16-year-old to die in prison. The film included interviews with jurors, legal experts, and Catherine Walsh, though Emma herself declined to participate, her attorneys advising against any public statements that might affect her ongoing appeals. The Ring doorbell camera that had provided the crucial evidence breaking open the case became the center of a technological ethics debate, with privacy advocates pointing to the Anderson case as an example of how everyday surveillance technology was creating a world where private actions were increasingly subject to documentation and scrutiny. Trevor Phillips, the neighbor whose camera had captured the damning evidence, expressed mixed feelings about his role in the case. I'm glad the truth came out, but it's strange to think that a security camera I installed to catch package thieves ended up sending a teenage girl to prison for life. I never thought about how these devices make us all witnesses to things we never intended to see. Billings West High School where William Anderson had taught for 15 years, created a memorial science garden in his honor, featuring native Montana plants and interpretive signs explaining the ecological systems at work in the small space. The garden became both an outdoor classroom for science teachers and a quiet place of reflection for students and faculty who had known and respected William. A simple stone marker at the garden center bore the inscription, "William James Anderson, 1982-2024. He taught us to see the wonder in the world around us," making no mention of the tragic circumstances of his death, but focusing instead on the positive impact of his life and career. Emma's second appeal, filed in early 2027, focused on ineffective assistance of counsel, arguing that her trial attorney had failed to adequately present expert testimony on adolescent brain development and the coercive influence of her relationship with an older man. This appeal, like the first, was rejected, though by a narrower margin, with two judges writing a strong dissent that questioned whether contemporary standards of decency permitted sentencing a juvenile to life without parole, regardless of the crime's severity. Legal observers noted that the divided decisions suggested Emma might eventually find success with federal appeals, though the process would likely take many years and offer no guarantee of a different outcome. 3 years after the murder, Emma granted her first interview to a graduate student researching juvenile offenders serving adult sentences. The resulting academic paper described a young woman who had aged beyond her years during her incarceration, developing an interest in psychology and taking every educational opportunity available within the prison system. The researcher noted that Emma spoke of her crime with what appeared to be genuine remorse, describing how her understanding of her actions and their impact had evolved as her brain matured, and the manipulative nature of her relationship with Mercer became clearer to her. "I couldn't see it then, but Jake never loved me," Emma was quoted as saying. "He loved the power he had over me, and I was so desperate to keep that relationship that I destroyed the only person who truly loved me unconditionally." William Anderson's students continued to feel the impact of his loss long after his death, with many changing their educational and career paths after losing their mentor and advocate. Jordan Martinez, who had been planning to attend community college, was accepted to MIT with a recommendation letter William had written just weeks before his death, describing Jordan's extraordinary potential and passion for scientific inquiry. At his graduation, Jordan wore a small chemistry-themed pin that had belonged to William, given to him by Catherine Walsh, who had maintained connections with many of her brother's former students. "Mr. Anderson believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," Jordan told local reporters. "Everything I achieve in my career will be partly because of him." The legal principle established in Emma's case, that juveniles could still receive life without parole for particularly premeditated murders, despite evolving standards regarding juvenile sentencing, influenced subsequent cases throughout Montana and neighboring states. Prosecutors in Wyoming and Idaho cited the Anderson decision when pursuing maximum sentences against juvenile offenders in similar cases, while defense attorneys in more progressive jurisdictions used it as an example of why juvenile justice reform was urgently needed. The case became a standard reference in law school criminal justice courses, with professors using it to illustrate the tension between retributive justice and developmental psychology in the treatment of juvenile offenders. A decade after the Christmas morning murder, Billings had largely moved on, though William Anderson's name remained honored at the high school, and through the scholarship program that had by then helped 12 students pursue higher education in scientific fields. Emma, now 26, had completed a bachelor's degree through a prison education program and was working on a master's in psychology, her prison counselor reporting that she had become a mentor to younger inmates and developed insight into her crime that had been absent during her trial. Catherine Walsh had retired from teaching and moved to Oregon to be near her children, making peace with her decision to sever contact with Emma while continuing to honor her brother's memory through annual contributions to the scholarship fund. The Anderson case eventually found its way into criminology textbooks as a case study in juvenile justice, family violence, and the intersection of digital evidence with criminal investigation. Law enforcement agencies across the country used the case in training sessions about the value of canvassing for private security cameras during murder investigations, with the Ring doorbell footage that had broken open the case becoming an iconic example of how everyday technology could capture crucial evidence. The increasing use of doorbell cameras and other private surveillance systems in the decade following the case created what one legal scholar called an ambient witness society, where traditional notions of privacy were being redefined by technology that constantly recorded public spaces. In the final analysis, the legacy of State versus Emma Anderson extended far beyond the specific tragedy of one family in Billings, Montana. It became part of the evolving national conversation about juvenile justice, digital privacy, and the criminal justice system's response to family violence. The case raised difficult questions about how society should balance accountability for heinous crimes against emerging understanding of adolescent development, questions that remained unresolved as Emma Anderson continued to serve her sentence. Growing from the 16-year-old who had killed her father into a young woman who would indeed, as Judge Blackwood had starkly predicted, grow old and die in prison unless future changes to juvenile sentencing laws eventually offered her a path to redemption that the current system had definitively closed.